Well, hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us here this evening on our panel discussion following a screening of The Age of Nature. Thank you so much for joining us. And I am here with three amazing panelists who do quite a bit of work on environmental stewardship and conservation here in San Antonio and across Texas. My name is Brendan Gibbons. I'm a senior environmental reporter for a nonprofit news outlet here in San Antonio called San Antonio Report. And I'm joined here with members of the San Antonio River Authority, the National Parks Conservation Association, and the Greater Edwards Aquifer Alliance. And I'm personally taking a break from San Antonio Report's annual City Fest festival. And if you like panel discussions like this, then you'll definitely appreciate this week-long event that we are putting on virtually this year because of the pandemic. We have panel discussions. I hosted one yesterday involving a researcher at the University of Texas at San Antonio about his work to model the coronavirus pandemic here. The San Antonio River Authority and then experts on stormwater from the city of San Antonio will be joining me tomorrow for a different panel discussing flooding here in San Antonio. Other panels deal with all kinds of civic engagement issues and everything from policing in San Antonio to how you manage a city during the pandemic. So the best way to join us is to go to cityfestsa.org. And again, that's cityfestsa.org, and then see how you can sign up. But right now, I'm excited to have our guests introduce themselves. And let's start, let's start with you, Suzanne, Director of the San Antonio River Authority. Please tell us a little bit about yourself and the kind of work your organization does.
Sure. Well, thank you, Brendan. It's great to be here this evening. My name is Suzanne Scott, and I'm the General Manager of the San Antonio River Authority, and I have been at the River Authority since 2000, and I've been General Manager since 2007. The River Authority, as you know, has been involved in a whole lot of projects in San Antonio. Our mission is to be committed to safe, clean, and enjoyable creeks and rivers, and we've been working really hard at that, from flood control to water quality to, of course, all the recreational additions that we've made to the river. So I'm glad to be here and look forward to the conversation.
Cary, tell us who you are and who you work for.
Sure. Thank you so much. It's wonderful to be here and talking about kind of how we can be inspired by the benefits and beauty of nature and being with these other conservation leaders in San Antonio. I serve as the Regional Director for Texas and Oklahoma for the National Parks Conservation Association. And we are an independent, nonprofit organization that's the voice of America's national parks. So for over 100 years, we've worked tirelessly in communities, in the courtroom, and in Congress to protect and preserve our parks for future generations. And we work with our more than 1.4 million members and supporters across the country, and we help them address a multitude of threats at our parks, including climate change, so we can keep the parks protected for generations to come.
Cary, I think that some people might accidentally confuse your organization with the National Park Service itself. Can you talk a little bit about the difference between you and the National Parks government?
Sure thing. We are a totally separate organization from the National Park Service. We do have a connection to the history of the National Park Service. So in 1916, when Stephen Mather started the National Park Service, about 3 years after that, he recognized that the national parks were created by people, but they still needed people to support them. As a federal governmental entity, the National Park Service can't really go to Congress and advocate for the needs that they have. So Stephen Mather said, let's create this other organization, totally separate, nonprofit organization, no specific ties to the National Park Service, who can really be that citizen's voice. So for over 100 years, we celebrated our centennial last year, so 101 years now. We've really been serving in that purpose, where we work very closely with the national parks, but we also work with the communities around the parks and with park advocates across the country to really ensure that those places that were protected and preserved are still there in the future.
Thank you. Annalisa, please tell us about you and the Greater Edwards Aquifer Alliance.
Yeah, I'm the Executive Director of the Greater Edwards Aquifer Alliance. I've been involved in water issues for a really long time. And then about 15 years ago, we started the Alliance. We started out with 9 member groups. in this, and we have now 53 member groups. So we serve 21 counties in Central Texas. It's basically the hill country. And our mission is to advocate protection of the Edwards and Trinity aquifers, these karst aquifers here in Central Texas, and also the flora and fauna and the history and culture of the Texas Hill Country. So we are engaged in issues at the state and local level. We go from north of Austin all the way down to Del Rio. So, and over the past 15 years, we've been really busy. So, as Texas grows, you know, the faster we grow, the busier our organization gets, because we're trying to impose some civilization on the growth that's occurring in our region.
When you said, you talk about your member groups, 53 member groups, right? Yeah. What groups might be members, and you know, not specifically, but what kind of groups might be members of like your umbrella organization?
No, we have actually a couple of chambers of commerce. We have church groups. We have neighborhood groups and environmental groups, and several other different types of civic groups. So it runs the gamut. About a third of the groups that are members, actually, we helped get started because there were areas that had nobody who was interested in water or environmental in those regions. And they had a crisis come up. And then we were like, hey, you guys got to stick together and because you need to be there to advocate in your region.
We've already got a question from social media, and I'm so happy to see it, from DeFranco Sarabia. What are some successful restoration projects being done in restoration projects being done in San Antonio? And are we working with other cities or organizations to streamline the restoration process? I think, Suzanne, I'd love to ask you about maybe what is the most successful restoration project in San Antonio history. Tell us about the kind of restoration work that was done on the San Antonio River.
Absolutely. We have done some significant restoration work on the San Antonio River. We call it the Mission Reach, which was a previously channelized part of the San Antonio River south of downtown that coincidentally is right next to our national park, our San Antonio Missions National Historical Park, which I know Cary will talk about in just a couple of minutes. But this project, the river, of course, is extremely important to our heritage and culture. And we wanted to go back in and restore that river to a more natural river, because when the Corps of Engineers came in and channelized it in the 60s and 70s, they basically took out all the trees, all the natural environment of the San Antonio River and made it a drainage ditch. So we came back in starting really in the late 90s, early 2000s to try to work with the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers to go back in and still have the flood protection of the river, which is important because the river carries a lot of floodwaters. But we also wanted to do it in a more naturalized way. So we use techniques called fluvial geomorphology that will allow for the river to still meander and be a natural river, but it's highly engineered in the way that it can still protect the community from flooding. So what we were able to do is we took 3 million cubic yards of soil out of the river so that we could allow for us to put trees in. Anyone that knows anything about engineering, anytime you put a tree in a river, it takes capacity or conveyance away from flood control. So we had to do this very, very highly engineered placement of trees and vegetation so that we could bring natural habitat back to the river. So we were very successful in doing this in essentially a 9-mile stretch, 8 miles of the Mission Reach and another mile called Eagle Land. And that project now has been in place since, completed since 2013, and has an amazing record of restoring the ecosystem. We have had thousands and thousands, tens of thousands of birds that have come back to the river. The avian species, the migratory birds have been incredible. The monarch butterflies, all these species are now returning to the river. And it just as the show that we watched tonight really talked about, the power of nature to heal itself is incredible. And we have seen it firsthand on the San Antonio River through this ecosystem restoration project. Now we are working on ecosystem restoration projects on Alazan, Apache, Martinez, and San Pedro Creeks. really trying to do much more of this because rivers and creeks function much better when they're in a more naturalized state. And we've learned that over the years that trying to channelize a river is not really the best way to manage it. So I'll stop there. We can talk more in a minute.
These creeks that you mentioned that you're turning to next are all located on the west side of San Antonio,
Yes,
which
they are.
it's probably a good place to go and see what the San Antonio River used to look like, right? Before,
Absolutely.
or, an example of that. Yeah.
Absolutely. Very channelized, a lot of riprap and rubble to try to keep the creek in its banks. I mean, it's very, not very stable and really needs to be restored so that it can function more naturally.
And I'm sure, because of your science and engineering beforehand, hundreds of millions of dollars went into this project. You knew that you were going to see some benefit, but have you been surprised or taken aback by the degree to which you are seeing more bird species on the river, that the water quality is better than it was before? I mean, has anything jumped out at you in the results you've gotten? Because it's been 10 years since completion. Correct me if I'm wrong.
Yeah, well, we completed that project in 2013.
I'm sorry.
So it's not quite, but I think that, I'm really impressed with how fast it's happened. We were told by the Corps of Engineers that the restoration would take, longer than what we've seen. And I'm just really pleased that the restoration of the habitat, the bird species, the fish, we even have, as you know, we've been doing a lot of work with native mussels in the river. And of course, and they are an indication, and all of the mussels and the fish that are coming back are an indication that the ecosystem is getting healthier and healthier, because we have species that are that do not tolerate pollution. So when you have these very sensitive species, that they can thrive because the water quality is getting better. So yes, I think the thing that I was most surprised about is how fast it's been, and how the variety of the avian species that have come through. And I know we talk about this quite a bit, but creating this ecosystem has really created this stopover habitat. We are in the central flyway from Mexico all the way up to the central part of the United States, and then all the way up into Canada. And having this stopover habitat in a highly urbanized area like San Antonio is really starting to improve our place in this migratory path.
And in San Antonio, the river is not just a river, but it's a flowing thread of history that connects this community to its past. And you can see that so well at the San Antonio missions. Cary, can you tell us about your organization's work at the missions themselves, and some of the effort to preserve that continuity?
Sure. The work along the mission reach, I think, is so important to enhancing and really talking about the cultural heritage at the San Antonio missions, because I think a lot of times people might think of the missions just as a church, but when you look at
I think we may have had some technical difficulties with Cary
as well. And so I think that's been really important. I think it also adds in some additional recreational opportunities to bring people to the missions and to have them more engaged with the National Park Service, where in the past they might not have been able to do that. But if they're able to take a bike ride or a run through the missions, then they'll be able to really explore what those missions have to offer and learn more about the history of their city. I think it was a really big component and a piece of the World Heritage designation, the NPCA, and I know Suzanne and many community leaders were a part of that as well. Looking at the economic benefit that having that complete and strong protected missions can bring in, and that World Heritage designation, I think, has really been good for the overall San Antonio community as well. When you look just at the economic impact of the San Antonio missions, it's about 131 million last year, according to the National Park Service. So all of that economic impact is from the missions, but it's also based in that work around the river. So as that mission reach continues, and it is amazing how fast that was able to happen. I think that really sets up more opportunities for the future.
Yeah, I think when Texans think of national parks, we have such low amounts of federal land in the state compared to other Western states, but they'll be familiar with Big Bend National Park for sure. But what are some of the other national parks and you know, national historic sites in your region that you are, you know, that are under your wing with the Texas chapter?
Sure. And, you know, you mentioned, you know, not many people may be familiar with our national parks. We do have 16 of them, but as a private land state, we don't have as much. I think one number that I saw, it's a little over 3% of land in Texas is actually held in public ownership. And as we look at kind of some of the video that we talked about and the importance of preserving land to help combat climate change, our national parks do provide an opportunity to do that. Big Bend is 800,000 acres of land out in West Texas that sequesters carbon. Guadalupe Mountains, just right north of that, is half of that park is wilderness, which means that you can't develop roads. You have to kind of keep it in that natural state as well. So we definitely work with both of those parks. And then another park that we work with is Amistad National Recreation Area. Annalisa, I know you mentioned your organization works all the way over to Del Rio. That's such an important recreation area, but it also provides some great conservation for those multiple ecosystems as the Devil's River, the Pecos River, and the Rio Grande all come together to converge as well. And then one last park that we work with a lot that I think is really relevant to the conversation that was in the videos today about the importance of trees and forests and sequestering carbon is the Big Thicket National Preserve. It's way over in the southeast of Texas, and it is known as the biological crossroads of North America because it has about 10 different ecosystems that come together all in that area. But one of the big projects the NPCA has been working there for about the last 10 years is restoration of the longleaf pine forest. That longleaf pine forest is so important to the climate resiliency of that area. It's important endangered species habitat for the red-cockaded woodpecker. And then it also is really able to withstand high winds from hurricanes and fires, both things that we're seeing with increased climate change impacts as well. So over the decade, we've worked with volunteers in the region and across the state to plant nearly 200,000 pine trees, little pine seedlings at the preserve. And then we're helping the park advance a 30,000 acre longleaf pine restoration effort, which will be a substantial help to the park in preserving those efforts. But also when you look at the devastating floods that Southeast Texas is having, that park can really act as a sponge and kind of a nature-based solution to mitigate some of the impacts of the flood. So it's really an example of kind of a national park that is providing recreational access, but also the great benefits that nature can have to grow and lessen the impacts of climate change.
Well, please correct me if I'm wrong, but my understanding is like one of the reasons that there's been able to be preservation of the longleaf pine is because of the listing on the endangered species list of the red-cockaded woodpecker, which you did just mention. And that's because that bird and that tree really in the ecosystem that surrounds them are really, you know, those are two keystone species of that particular type of habitat, right?
Yeah.
And there was news this week about potential removal of the red-cockaded woodpecker from the endangered list. I guess I bring it all up because I wonder, you know, I think people who are interested in these issues might see the environmental fights kind of come to an arena about a little particular animal, but it's usually about more than that animal. Can you kind of relate that to the longleaf?
Sure. You know, that definitely is a piece of the longleaf restoration. There's a lot of work being done. I think Texas has one of the largest numbers of private landowners that have signed up for kind of safe harbor agreements or conservation efforts to protect the red-cockaded woodpecker. So it's not just the efforts on public lands, it's kind of those private land stewards as well. And kind of we at NPCA recognize that we have to work with everybody in the region and think those efforts are so important. I think when you look at the longleaf pine, though, it was a piece of it. And I think you're exactly right that sometimes that species gets blown up a little bit, but there's always kind of a wider effort to support those ecosystems. You know, when you look at the Big Thicket, there was an effort starting back in the 1930s to really preserve that area in light of a lot of timber development and oil and gas development in Southeast Texas. So for over 40 years, community leaders said, we need to preserve this region, which includes that longleaf pine habitat as well. So I think it's overall a really a community effort to say we appreciate this habitat for the natural resources it provides, but also for the recreation and then kind of the cultural piece of it as well. Of like, this is their life exploring the big thicket too.
Interestingly, like the way that an endangered species fight has made a big difference for San Antonio has been a lawsuit in the 1990s by the Sierra Club to protect endangered species that depend on the Edwards Aquifer. And really, the system of water regulations that we live under today blossomed out of the water fights of the 1990s. Annalisa, you've been involved since then, and can you tell us the state of the Edwards Aquifer right now, good and bad?
Yeah, I mean, going back to the Endangered Species Act, we don't have a lot of tools for protecting, say, our water quality and our air quality. But the Endangered Species Act is one tool that the feds give us. So when the water fight started in San Antonio, like you said, Sierra Club filed a lawsuit on the Endangered Species Act. But mainly it was San Antonio was overpumping, which was threatening to deplete the spring flows at San Marcos and Comal Springs. And then the basin estuaries and the whole ecosystem down there depend on the flows from those springs. So it was this whole big ecosystem. But really the endangered species were the tools that we were able to use. And I'll tell you, we just finally completed that Edwards Aquifer Habitat Conservation Plan a few years ago and finally settled who gets what as far as water allocations. So since that time, we've been able to concentrate more on water quality than water quantity. And I just wanted to also say, since Suzanne mentioned the migratory birds, a lot of our member groups are having an effort during the month of October to get people to turn out their outdoor lighting during this month, because we have all these birds migrating, and apparently the lights when they go over cities really mess them up. So you can go to the Audubon, like the Audubon Society will have information, and several of the other groups. But you asked about the state of the aquifer. You know, we are blessed with one of the most incredible water resources of any region in the world, mainly because the Edwards Aquifer it recharges so quickly. You know, when you hear on the news, you see it on the weather report that it rained and then that aquifer level came up like a foot or sometimes even 2 feet. That's incredibly rare. Most aquifers recharge, some of them, just inches per year, and so they're going into water deficit. But we've got this renewable resource that's really pretty amazing and pretty unique in all the world. We're working really hard to protect it, but with the growth that's going on in our area, the scientists are really concerned because they don't know what the capacity of the aquifer is for pollution loading. So we know we've had to shut public supply wells already. And so we're working really hard to try to make sure that it stays the amazingly clean water source that it is right now. Basically what we're relying on is we're pretty much still relying on dilution as the solution to pollution. We're not regulated as well as we should be.
When you say development, and really the main issue is that there's just asphalt, concrete, and hard surface going in over and upstream of the sensitive areas where the aquifer recharges, right? So imagine all the things that run off of a parking lot or sediment and all that stuff, making it into the drinking water source. And saying that we are lucky to have this incredible resource. We also don't have water pretreatment plants the way that many other cities do, because other cities rely on lakes and rivers, and we kind of just pull it up out of the ground, put some chlorine and fluoride into it, and that's our drinking water. So pretty vital, important stuff.
Yeah, and region-wide, the pollution from stormwater runoff, non-point source pollution is a huge problem, and that's pretty much a huge problem nationwide. Now, here in Central Texas, we have these wonderful spring-fed rivers and creeks and all, and so one of the things that we're having to deal with a lot is permits to discharge sewage effluent into those waterways. So we're constantly fighting that. And I mean, the yak factor is off the charts on that, but the state still allows it. And so a lot of those creeks and streams where they run across the recharge zone are major recharge features for the Edwards and Trinity aquifers. So yeah, I mean, we've had to learn, way more about sewage than I ever wanted to know, but that's also a component.
It is a great kind of segue to another audience question we have from Peter Bella, which is, when will we be able to swim in the San Antonio River? I will say I've lived in formerly industrialized parts of the U.S. where the pollution that you're worried about is from like PCBs, which are really, or lead. It's like nasty industrial contamination. That is not the case in San Antonio. What is our main pollution source, Suzanne, in the San Antonio River and its tributaries?
Actually, it's interesting because Annalisa was talking about it as it relates to the biggest threat to the, one of the biggest threats to the aquifer. The biggest threat to the San Antonio River is stormwater runoff. And the stormwater that happens after rain events, of course, as you mentioned, all the impervious cover that we have, all of the rain picks up all the pollutants on all the hardened surfaces, all the bacteria, all the hydrocarbons, everything else, and all of that flows into a creek, and then ultimately there are many big cities that they don't, they have a combined sewer system with their stormwater system. We don't have that. Our creeks and rivers serve as the conveyance for all of our floodwaters. So all of those pollutants go right into our creeks and rivers, and that's our biggest threat. So as far as the swimming, thank you, Peter, for the question. The challenge is really, most times when it's not raining, the river is very high quality, very good quality water. I mean, it probably meets in most cases the primary contact recreation standard, which would be the standard that would allow for people to swim in the river. The problem is that after rain events, we have these very big spikes of bacteria and pollutants that makes it unsafe for swimming. So what we're trying to do is get the community to understand that what the actions that we do on our land do impact the quality of our rivers. I mean, essentially our river is a barometer of how well we're managing our land. So we need to do better with those types of strategies. So I know Annalisa and us and others are looking at trying to use low impact development, more natural ways to mitigate the impacts of pollution. We're going to continue to grow, but instead of just having a parking lot, how about a parking lot next to a buffer, have a buffer zone, have a rain garden, something where that parking lot and all of the pollutants that come from it will go through a vegetated filter strip before it goes into a creek or river. These are basic strategies using our land. And it was very similar to what we saw in the film tonight and what they had to do with the Panama Canal. I mean, they had to realize that the economics of that community and that country were going to be affected by the lack of management of their natural resources. So they realized, hello, we better protect this. This is very important to the economic health and viability of our community. So the same thing here. We all need to start thinking about how we can continue to grow, but grow in a more sustainable way so that we can have better, cleaner water, so we can swim in the river, so we can also make sure that we manage floods. I mean, Cary mentioned the fact that the rushing floodwaters that are coming into Amistad. Well, we see that here with the growing amount of impervious cover. We're in flash flood alley. We get that, that topography change from the north to the south and the rushing water, the devastation that brings to our rivers, but also to life and property. So we really need to start thinking about managing that, how people and nature can thrive together is what we really need to start thinking about more holistically. And I think this pandemic has really brought that to the surface. I think people are understanding we don't know what's going to happen tomorrow. We all realize that. So we need to start thinking about protecting our natural resources in a way that we can all coexist and use nature to help us all thrive and have a better economics, but also a better life and health.
One really hopeful story that was told in the film was about Bhutan, which is, listed now as the only carbon negative country because of the way it manages its forests to suck carbon out of the air and store it in forests and natural habitat. And Annalisa, before we went live, we were talking about an interesting project that GIA will be involved with called Water Sponge Carbon Sink. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, it's really exciting. Our staff, we've been working for a long time on the low impact development and using certain land management techniques to enhance infiltration of stormwater into our groundwater reservoirs. But then my staff realized that those same techniques that we were advocating also enhance carbon capture on the land. And so we have a short film about that on our website, but we started putting it out there, and then it was great because all these people got interested really quickly. So here in San Antonio, we're working with several entities, including the City Parks Department, to have 10 pilot projects, one in each, a park in each district, where we test those out and see how much it's enhancing the carbon capture. And then we're also working with other entities to set up carbon markets here in Central Texas. So perhaps if this works really well in, say, San Antonio was to use these techniques in not only just our parks, but all of our open spaces. We have a lot of large office campuses and cemeteries, all sorts of open spaces. We would be capturing literally tons and tons of carbon and taking it out of the air. And so with setting up this carbon markets, we're gonna hope to encourage landowners of large tracts of land to use these techniques and actually get paid for doing so. They'll get paid for the carbon capture. And perhaps if it's really successful in San Antonio, someday the city of San Antonio might get paid for taking that carbon out of the air too.
That is really interesting, especially in the context of San Antonio's climate action and adaptation plan. This was a big environmental struggle last year to make a commitment to the city going effectively carbon neutral by 2050, as called for in the Paris Climate Accords that I think probably a lot of listeners here will be familiar with, to limit the worst effects of climate change and managing land in a way that can be used as a carbon sink as a way to deal with carbon pollution that's already happened. And the sources, as I think everyone here knows, generally from deforestation, but also human use of fossil fuels, power plants and industrial sites and vehicle emissions for the most part. And in Texas, we talk a lot about water. We don't talk as much about air, but really there are some effects from air pollution that is reaching as far as West Texas and the Big Bend area. In fact, today there was a revision to a regional haze plan by the state environmental regulator, the Texas Commission on Environmental Quality. Cary, that's something your organization's been involved with a little bit. I wonder if you can share your work on that.
Sure. Air quality is something that impacts our national parks across the country. It is probably one of the most widespread threats to our national parks. We have about 97% of them are impacted by air quality. Many of them are impacted by water quality as well, but air quality is something that's prevalent from the small parks and historical sites in urban areas to the big vista parks as well. And we have at NPCA have been working on this issue for a while, and luckily for national parks, there's actually a rule that you mentioned, the regional haze rule, that is specific to national parks. It requires under the Clean Water Act that EPA prepare these rules that would reduce pollution that impact Class 1 sites, which Class 1 sites are in Texas, Big Bend and Guadalupe Mountains. So if you've ever been out to Big Bend or Guadalupe Mountains, and kind of towards the end of the day, it gets really hazy and it's hard to see. I think one example is when you're sitting in the Chisos Basin and look out at the window per se, it's super, super hazy. Well, a lot of that pollution is actually coming from coal plants as far as away from East Texas or the Southeast. There's some more haze pollution that's coming from some of the oil and gas industry that's a little bit closer, especially around Guadalupe Mountains now. So we at NPCA have worked kind of previously to have some reductions, and so far we've been able to eliminate more than 1.4 million tons of visibility impairing pollution from those parks. But this announcement today is actually a second round of kind of here's the next step. And the goal of this rule is to move those, to clear the air to where it looks to natural conditions. So back to, before there were a lot of industry and development around it, what that air would look like. And so we are working with advocates and would love to share with y'all the opportunity to provide comment on that rule. The comment period actually opens on Friday, and asking for additional sources to be included and some additional reductions in pollution, so it can really move the ball forward on clearing the air over our national parks, because it's not just important for the visitor safety, but it's important for the natural resources as well. We work so hard to develop and really protect the trees and the land, but we also need to make sure that the air in the area is just as pristine and available as well.
And if people want to submit comments on that, I'm on the TCEQ webpage right now, and I'm not finding an easy way to do that. Is there a link on your website that can help them?
It is very way far down their website. I can send out, if you go to npca.org and you go to kind of regional haze, we may not have the information there, but in the coming weeks, we have what we call park talks, because we aren't able to get out and visit and be in the parks, our favorite places to be right now. We're really providing virtual opportunities for people to learn about issues on the park. So October 27th, we will be having a park talk specifically on regional haze and an opportunity for people to engage in that. So I encourage anybody who wants to learn more about their national parks right now, just experience them from their home and find out more about the threats that are facing them, to watch those park talks. So it's npca.org/park talks.
I'd love to ask you all about different ways to get involved with your organizations. And, let me just say, I am a journalist. I write here in San Antonio about environmental issues. I know that people getting involved makes a difference. I know that people writing letters and emails and showing up at public comment sessions does sway opinions. I can tell you countless times where I've seen it happen. And I know that volunteer work does make a difference. And I think when we, sometimes it's easy to feel hopeless about these kind of things. It's easy to feel overwhelmed and you can't really do anything, because there are a lot of threats to the land, air, and water that we rely on. But I would love it if each of you could kind of go around and talk a little bit about how you'd like people to be engaged with your organizations and, volunteering their time or energy. Suzanne, let's start with you.
Sure. Thank you. Well, a couple of things. First of all, we do have a River Warrior program at the River Authority that I would hope that anyone going to sanantonioriver.org will look to see. It says, how can you get involved? So please, if you're really interested in doing work, and what we do on our volunteers is, of course, we sometimes ask volunteers to come pick up trash. That's a big threat to the San Antonio River. Again, another example of how urbanism has really affected our natural resource. But there's also restoration opportunities. We do get our volunteers involved with restoration. We are also asking some of our volunteers to serve as trail stewards, similar to what the city of San Antonio is doing. We're combining with the city of San Antonio to really enhance trail stewardship. Just having volunteers along the trails to help people as they're using the trails, because they're becoming very popular. So there's all kinds of opportunities to really get involved. And we would hope that people would get inspired by the shows today, but as well as this talk, to really do what they can do. I also think if you don't want to volunteer, but you still want to take some personal actions, I would suggest that you also go to our website, our Be River Proud site, can talk to you a little bit about things that you can do at your own house to really think about the impact that your home may be having on the water quality of our rivers and creeks. You can turn your downspout so that your downspout on your driveway, but it goes into your yard. Get a rain barrel. Do simple things. Build a rain garden. We have a way on our website that you can, exactly do the measurements of how to build a rain garden based on the size of your property. So there's all kinds of things you can do. And I would just encourage people to not think they're hopeless, because everybody can do something that will make the river, in this case, cleaner, safer, and more enjoyable. I do want to say that do be sure you pick up your trash. If you're walking around your neighborhood and you see a water bottle, pick it up, because that water bottle in that next rain will end up in a creek and ultimately in the San Antonio River. So just think about that and just do your part to be a good steward.
Annalisa, what's the best way for people to be involved in protecting the aquifer?
Well, I think we put out regular alerts. And since we cover such a large area, sometime it'll be, we need people to call county commissioners in this county. So that's those constituents. The state legislature is coming up in January 2021. During the legislative session, we really need people's representatives to hear from them. So if you go to our website, you can sign up to get these alerts. And we kind of mix it up, because sometimes I'll say too, like this group is having this party or these events. We kind of connect the whole region through our member groups, but we really, we have heard from so many, especially the state legislators, but all kind of elected officials, how much it affects them when they're getting a lot of messages from our members. And then if you have expertise in a particular area, we rely really heavily on volunteers with expertise. We could not do the work that we do if we had to pay all the engineers and biologists and different experts, hydrologists and all. So you can get involved with us in our research projects. And then on October 21st, we're participating in Imagine a Day Without Water, but we're asking everybody to imagine a day without bottled water. So we'll be putting a campaign out there. And then lastly, you can also make donations on our website because we really, we stretch every dollar to the limit. So if you go on our website, and like I said, if you sign up for the alerts, but also we'll post news articles and all, and so people can get engaged.
That interesting you mentioned a day without bottled water, because we had a question from audience member about a day of no plastic bottles. So the idea, I guess, you go a day without plastic water bottles and you come to realize pretty quick you don't need plastic water bottles, or most single-use plastics. I think I'm on safe ground as a reporter being anti-bottled water. I'm going to come out right here and say it.
We're really tired of seeing them in the water. I mean, everywhere we go. We have a big region. I can't tell you how many, and Suzanne can probably tell you how many water bottles have been picked up by the volunteers.
Tons and tons and tons. Go down to the river anytime after it rains in the Mission Reach, and you will see a lot of water bottles.
Cary, we asked how people could get involved on the haze issue in particular, but how would you encourage them to be part of stewarding the national parks or historic sites wherever they are?
Sure. There's so many different options for people to get engaged on kind of personal level and kind of however they want to in their individual park or supporting overall parks across the country. One of the things that I really took away from the videos today was a comment that said, no one person can stop climate change. We must come together to do this. And so I feel like that's the same thing when we're talking about conservation of our natural resources, is each person can take a step themselves, but coming together and working in a coalition can make such an impact. We saw that this summer with a historic piece of legislation that was passed and signed by the president, the Great American Outdoors Act, that actually provided significant amount of funding for deferred maintenance at our national parks, but also fully authorized a source of funding for local and state and federal parks as well. So all of that was able to happen because there were thousands of hours, many advocates from across the country really reaching out to their elected officials and saying this is important. So that's one thing that you can do, is talk to your elected official, your local city council person, your state official, your your federal congressman, and let them know you care about this issue. There doesn't have to be a big vote coming up for you to talk to them about. Just develop a relationship so they know you care. And then as there is a big vote, definitely let them know what you think about that vote. And then I think, if you want to get more involved in NPCA and the way that we work to support our parks, our website is full of information. You can go to npca.org. Specifically, there's an advocacy page, so it's npca.org/advocacy. And then I also want to follow up on the picking up trash piece. That is so important. It's an issue for our national parks. And if any of y'all love Big Bend and go out to Big Bend, take your trash with you. That park actually is one of the only parks in the National Park Service that has a landfill on site. So right in the middle of the national park is a 17-acre landfill. If you leave your trash there, it stays in the park. So NPCA is actively working with the park and the region to develop some solutions, because that park is also expected to be at capacity within the next 5 years. So there's a question of where does it go? Nobody wants to expand a landfill within a national park. And so it's not even just take it out of the park and drop it off in the gateway community of Terlingua or Marathon. They're struggling with some of the same challenges. Take it back with you to San Antonio or wherever your home is and dispose it there. But also when you think about the San Antonio missions, part of your federal tax dollars go to the missions having to pay for trash removal. So just be really cognizant of kind of what that impact of trash is on those natural places.
Pretty fascinating about the Big Bend National Park landfill nearing capacity. I think I have a story idea now. Well, among many here, it's been a really great discussion. I really thank all three of you for being so giving of your time and your knowledge. And there's an incredible wealth of knowledge here. And I really hope everyone learned as much as I did, and also and really enjoyed the film and felt inspired by it. You'll be able to watch the Age of Nature documentary series on KLRN, and you can see the schedule for the screenings of those on klrn.org. Panelists at this event will also be able to post links in the comment section for our Facebook live stream, so they can tell you how to follow up on some of the topics we discussed and get involved with their organizations. My name again is Brendan Gibbons. I cover environmental issues, full-time job for the San Antonio Report, local independent nonprofit newsroom here, and we depend on donors and members at even as low as $25 a year to support this kind of work. And if you like panel discussions like these, again, I encourage you to go to cityfestsa.org and join us for the next 2 days of our panel discussions. There's going to be a lot of good stuff. So thanks very much again. Pleasure speaking with all of you, and have a good evening.